Alrighty. So, Brooke Struck, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Really glad to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. And we'll dive right in. I've given you a little bit of preamble so you know a bit about why you're here, but others don't know who you are and why you're here. So I'll ask you to just briefly introduce yourself, who you are, and what you bring to the world.
Sure. My name is Brooke Struck. I'm the research director at the Decision Lab. We are a behavioral science research and consulting firm based in Montreal. My background is in the philosophy of science. I've done one tour of duty in government, and I've been working in private sector consulting since then. And I would consider myself a concerned citizen who wants to be more active in helping our country and our world to walk in better directions and along better paths than we currently find ourselves on.
Nice. Thank you for that. And just in the spirit of transparency, I'll explain how we're connected, which is kind of fun in the context of ESG, environmental, social, and governance work from where I'm concerned, because it's a former boss, Ralph Vizel, when I used to work in the financial services sector. And he and I hadn't been in touch for decades, and then got reacquainted, and he said, "Oh, you're in Montreal, you should really connect with Brooke." And so I did. So that was before my ESG time, and I feel like he kind of threw me forward into the future, and connecting with you has been led to really rich and interesting discussion. And I think you're a great person to explore this conversation with, not being in ESG, but having a kind of wider perspective. So that's how we're connected. Thank you for agreeing to do this. And just before we go further into the questions that I've prepared, as you know, we're going to be talking about TD Bank. And I just want to check if you have any commercial relationship with that company.
No, I don't have any commercial relationship either through the firm where I'm working or myself as a client, as a user of their services.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be asking some pretty specific questions about TD Bank. But before I do that, since this is a conversation as part of a wider process around the role of industry in society and the future, I'd really like to hear in your own words about the future you want. And I'll just put that in a bit of context. Definitely in the field of sustainability, the one I've been playing around in, and I know you bump into this as well in your work, there's a lot of terms and labels thrown around: circular economy, sustainable development, regenerative economics, all kinds of things. And those are maybe useful tags here and there, but it'd be much more useful for this conversation to hear in your words, what is the future you want? What's it like, in as much detail as you can provide?
Yeah. So first off, I think that there's a kind of baseline necessity to ensure the ongoing livability of our planet. For the human species, for other species as well. I don't think about other species in strictly instrumental terms, but I also recognize that there is, in addition to whatever inherent intrinsic value there is to other species, they also have a very, very important instrumental value to the survival of humanity. Like a lot of what we depend on is actually generated and produced by a diverse ecosystem. Ecosystem services are really, really important. And, we tend to not value them until all of a sudden they're gone because nobody pays for them. Like all of a sudden when bees aren't pollinating things for free, we then realize that bees were super valuable. And we realize that because then we need to pay outrageous sums of money to ship bees across countries or pay people to pollinate things manually or all kinds of things like that. So that's my kind of first base layer of consideration, is the livability of the planet moving forward. Beyond that, I would say, the next kind of tranche is something around social stability, and that'll be connected to things like food security and energy security, certain levels of representativity in government, and people feeling like they have a voice that is heard. All the kinds of things that can lead to like massive chaotic disruptions like violent revolution and these kinds of things, like those are tangible bads that are worth avoiding. And for me, an ideal state does not contain such things. I'll stop there. Maybe we can probe deeper as we continue.
Sure. Yeah, I love it. I like the sounds of that future very much. And if more details or color commentary surface, feel free to raise it. And meanwhile, if you
Yep.
can sort of hold that future as a thought bubble as we're going through the questions about TD and your thoughts there, that'll be really helpful.
Yep.
So with that, I'd like to talk about what matters most in relation to TD Bank as a company. And that's sort of the purpose behind a materiality assessment, is what matters to these folks. And in particular, as much as possible, to stay focused on their business model. So essentially, what they do as a company, lend and transact financially, is essentially what they do all day and how they make money. And to keep that business model in mind, even though we know, I'm leading the witness a little bit, I'll explain why I'm saying that, because we know they have lots of philanthropic initiatives, do lots of tree planting, community engagement, et cetera. And those are great. And I hope they keep going with those things. But that's not the main way that they function as a business. So
It's not their
primarily,
core business.
exactly. So primarily we're considering their core business in these questions. And so thinking about their core business, when you think about positive impacts, things resulting from the activities of the bank, you think about TD Bank's activities in Canada, across the land, what do you believe it's doing that will create or contribute to that future that you just described? And any sort of evidence or examples in as much detail as you can describe.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I want to say there. The first is that I'm not super intimately familiar with the functioning of TD Bank to the exclusion of other big banks in Canada. I'm aware of the industry and its functioning to a certain degree, but I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on TD, and I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in banking, although compared to some random person that you might just pick off the street, I probably have a little bit more knowledge about what goes on in the banking world. So that's one, and the other is the comment you made about core business, which I think is really, really important. That ultimately a lot of what organizations do is kind of the peripheral elements of their business to shore up their brand image, to secure kind of long-term license to operate, these kinds of things. Like, they can provide some counterweight, but ultimately, if there is a conflict between the core business and these kinds of peripheral features, the core business is going to win out every time. So what comes to mind there is, like, when companies are doing well, they can sometimes indulge in these things that kind of detract from the most direct path from where they currently stand, and the greatest profitability that they can get to. But when push comes to shove, if something that is important to you stands in the way between a company and profit in the way that companies are currently run, the likelihood is that thing's just going to get trampled all over, because ultimately, like, the company exists for the purpose of creating profit. That's not the way that companies must exist. It's not the way that all companies exist. But certainly when I think about big banks, like, creating profit is the major reason that they are in business. And that has a long legacy to it in terms of stakeholder or shareholder capitalism. And that's a complicated conversation. We don't need to unpick that right now. But when I think about the banks in Canada, what I think about is that essentially, when we look at long-term survivability on the planet, we think about things like carbon emissions, great example, biodiversity, something that is very, very pressing as well, and actually interrelated with carbon, not just in that climate change destroys habitats and threatens species, but also that biodiversity itself contributes to climate resilience. So there's a more complicated story to tell there. When I think about banks and the kind of organizational logic around what decisions get made and how they operate, decreasing carbon emissions is not the top of their agenda. Protecting biodiversity, enhancing biodiversity, not the top of their agenda. They tend to treat these categories of things as risks to be managed, And those risks can be treated in a number of ways. They can be treated either as material risks. So for instance, we can think about the climate risk, just certain assets that a bank might hold on its balance sheet and invest in. Those can be direct climate risks. So investing in something that might actually be destroyed or made underwater by climate change, or they can be climate policy risks, which are not necessarily things that would be damaged by climate change itself, but would be damaged by people waking up and saying, oh my gosh, we need to do something about climate change. For example, the bitumen sands in Alberta are ones that they're not necessarily directly threatened by a changing climate, but they are certainly on the crosshairs of changing climate policy. So that's one sense in which climate, and hopefully in a near future, biodiversity will be perceived by businesses as something that actually has a material impact on their operations. But they're primarily still viewed through a risk lens, either that kind of risk or perception risk lens, as in TD Bank has an interest in not being perceived to be a climate laggard. And therefore they have an interest in doing things that improve the perception of their operations in terms of climate impacts. And once again, I just want to, throw up this clear signal that this is not at all limited to TD Bank. This is definitely something that's inherent within the banking industry. So then maybe the next place to go is to think about conversations about effective risk discussions and how carbon gets priced into assets. So Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, then Bank of England, is now the special envoy on climate, I think, for the UN. One of the big things that he's working on right now, if not the big thing, is about how to price climate risk into assets, so that we can actually make informed choices as investors about what assets we are buying and what risks are inherent in those assets, given the very important changes in climate as well as climate policy. Now, I think that those kinds of advances are really, really important. As I say, I would love to see us get past a risk lens. I would love to see us get to a point where we actually view the creation of positive climate externalities as things that people are willing to pay for. That leads more into the kind of path of regeneration, as opposed to the current path, which is like mediation and mitigation. And then what I think about is discussions around okay, well, how are the banks participating in helping to build those kinds of frameworks and actually get them implemented, not just in thought leadership, but actually operationalizing some of these frameworks. My sense is that the Canadian banks, like large banks in Canada as a whole, are not particular leaders on this internationally. And one of the major reasons for that is that the Canadian banking sector is heavily involved in the Canadian energy sector, and especially the oil and gas sector. And we know that those are just not going to be part of a healthy energy mix several decades down the line. If we think about the lifespan of oil and gas infrastructure that's being built, new wells and these kinds of things, we need to stop consuming these things before the lifespan of those assets runs out. But we're not at a point yet where we can sit down and have a mature global conversation about a carbon budget and what's fitting into that budget and who has kind of license and moral license to operate to not surpass that budget.
Oh yeah, there's a lot in there. That sort of mature global conversation challenge. I want to run down that trail, but holding off on doing so. Are there specific, either positive or negative, or maybe a mix of both, impacts that you're seeing now? And let me just play back a bit of what I'm hearing and see if more comes up. So a lot of this sits in the policy and sort of risk management, almost investor engagement level, which I think is really key. And Mark Carney's been a big player in the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. And exactly as you say that, even though if you dig in the word and you can find opportunity, it's really all about risk management. The vast majority of disclosures they're looking for are related to risk. So that may be plenty. There's lots there. I'm curious if you are noticing specific impacts on biodiversity, on climate, on communities, on infrastructure, equality, et cetera, based on how you see the banks functioning now.
Yeah. So this particular moment for us to be having this conversation is an interesting one, because of what's going on in Ukraine and Russia right now, and all of the questions that that's throwing open around energy security, but also sustainability, which luckily is high on the agenda when people are talking about energy security these days. Like 10 years ago, I don't know that energy, that sustainability would have been so much at the foreground of these conversations when energy security is really at stake. But today, thankfully, it is. So when I look at that and I think about the actions of banks, I think about what kinds of projects are getting payrolled or getting bankrolled, I should say. And, it's a whole bunch of projects. It includes a whole bunch of projects that really can't fit into a reasonable carbon budget for humanity. And that's not an individual actor problem, it's a collective action problem, which is perhaps why you see me moving more towards the kind of the policy conversations around this, is that we have massive collective action problems right now. And the banking sector, in one sense, is neutral in that. Like, they're just putting money into the status quo, but they're not responsible for the fire, they're just pouring on the gasoline. That's all that financing really is, right? It's like you're just putting more energy into the situation. When you put more money into the ecosystem, more people work on it, and you kind of gravitate all this attention towards doing something. So the more money that they continue to put into the oil and gas sector, like, the more activity is going to be going on there. They're not the ones who are creating this market, but the dollars that they're investing in it really do accelerate that market and push it forward. And if those dollars were not going there, then the market itself would be forced to shift in different directions. So are the banks are they responsible for this problem? Like, did they cause this problem? No. The reality is we all did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was collective action that got us in. And sadly, it's collective action that has to get us out. And the banks have, in my mind, a particular responsibility on that front because of the kind of accelerating function that capital plays in collective action.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. I'm gonna ask you for an answer to an impossible question.
Lay it on me.
Yeah. And I'm also super hypocritical with this, in that I'm gonna have you look at a 2x2 matrix and ask you to plot the company. And it's exactly what I complain about with traditional materiality, but I'm gonna really, the value here isn't just hearing your reasoning, right? There's no perfect answer. It's going to just take me a second to pull the screen up, and then I'm going to explain a little bit what's here. Tell me, do you see a 2x2 matrix here with your name on it?
I do indeed.
Okay, terrific. So let me just briefly explain what we've got here. The vertical axis relates to the health of the ecosystem, also sometimes referred to as the environment. And then the horizontal axis is relating to society, people, the social impacts. Even separating those is problematic, but bear with me. The middle is zero, neutral, no positive or negative impact. As we go to -5, we're getting to this company is undermining that future you described. So the more negative, the more it's undermining or making less likely. +5 is the degree to which the company is contributing to or actually building that future that you want, that I also quite would like. And so with those two dimensions of the impact on ecosystem health versus the impact on societal health, I would ask you to tell me where you think the TD Bank bubble should be placed and why?
Right. I'm going to put it at a -3 on ecosystem health.
Ecosystem health, okay. And how
And
about
okay, first I want to explain my reasoning on ecosystem health.
okay.
So there's another dimension, like there's something that's missing in your graph here that
Mhm.
I have just been describing, which is this kind of accelerator function. Like the thing about a bank is it's a gas pedal or a brake. And right now it's not a steering wheel, but we need steering.
Hmm.
That's the issue that's missing for me here. Like
Yep.
if the size of the bubble is how influential is this thing, the size needs to be huge relative to, well, I mean, the size of like the investment industry and TD Bank as one of, you know, the major players in the Canadian investment industry. Like it has a huge impact on the outcome.
Yeah.
Currently, that impact is negative. There are things that TD Bank and the banking sector more generally can do to make that impact more positive. But like fundamentally, the steering is not only their responsibility, but that accelerating function is clearly like that's their core business. And the steering right now is negative, which is why I put it at -3. I don't put it at -4 or -5 because, like, you know, as the old saying goes, like the pessimist says, you know, things couldn't possibly be worse, and the optimist says, oh yes, they could.
Nice. Okay. So it could be even worse.
It could
Nice.
be even worse.
Okay. I love it.
And impact on societal health. Um, I'm inclined to say that's a net positive,
Okay.
maybe a +2.
Around there, maybe.
Yeah, I think that looks about right to me. And the reasons for that are the following. There's been a lot of bad press about the banking industry as a whole, not just in Canada, globally, over the last 15 years or so. A lot of that bad press has been greatly deserved. However, banking also plays a really important function in our society for the allocation of capital. So for instance, if we think about people starting businesses, if we think about people buying homes, if we think about people just being able to transact efficiently, you know, going to a store or just transferring money from one person to the next, you know, giving your daughter a gift for her birthday, you know, that kind of thing. Like all of that kind of stuff is actually really essential for the like harmonious and good functioning of a society. It's all super unsexy stuff, but it's really important. And if it stopped working well, we'd be in big trouble. So there's a lot about the core business of the banking sector that creates a lot of value for society. The challenges, I think, come, you know, why is it not higher then if banks are doing such wonderful things for society? The challenges there, I think, are around the inequalities that the way those services are delivered can create. So the way that risks are assessed, the way that investment decisions are influenced by racial features, by all kinds of other elements that like really we don't want informing financial decisions in what we would consider to be a fair society. There's just a lot more work to be done in making sure that those kinds of decisions are as unbiased as possible. Banks themselves, in the way that they operate, also facilitate, like, you know, I talked about this great thing around, you know, facilitating payments and, you know, making like smooth, you know, nice friction-free markets for this kind of thing. One of the challenges that arises there is that it, like very smooth, efficient markets also tend to be ones that are very brittle. They're not resilient. They tend to create winner take all markets. So that's a big concern that I have about the role of the finance industry. And And that includes, investment more broadly. Like the idea that more efficiency is always better works great as long as you never anticipate any changes happening to your ecosystem. Because what you end up doing is hollowing out all of the redundancy. So there's only one path from point A to point B, and you make that path as smooth and friction free as you can.
Yeah.
The challenge is, as soon as there is the most minor disruption on that direct path from point A to point B, you have no fallback options. Witness COVID and supply chain disruptions.
Yeah.
All of these supply chains have been built to be hyper optimized, hyper efficient, and there's no redundancy in the system whatsoever. And as soon as there start to be some cracks or fissures, the whole thing starts falling apart. And the funny thing is, it actually hasn't, once again, this optimist who believes that like things could be much, much worse. Supply chains have not broken down nearly as badly as they could. Like the bottom of the barrel is much deeper than what we see right now.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, especially for, you and me sitting in Montreal, where, we're nowhere close to how bad things could be.
Yeah. And I mean, once again, coming back to, the war in Ukraine, like Ukraine is a major supplier on the global food markets. And all of that is in chaos right now. What are the famines that are going to be emerging? Not here in Montreal. Like food prices go up and we wring our hands about 3-decade high inflation, but like there's still food in the grocery store. And you and I are not the ones who are lining up at food banks to get access to that food. We're not living in a country that doesn't have food banks in it to that are stocked to supply us, even if we end up in these intense moments of need and crisis. Like we are insulated from so much of that.
For now.
For now.
Yeah. Okay, that's great context on the social piece. A question sparks that I just want to check if it changes or affects how you've ranked this, which is when you describe that sort of almost like the basics of the social fabric that we tend not to even notice on a financial transaction level. Yeah. For sure, the banks are fundamental in that sort of systemic integrity. And a big part of all 5 of Canada's big banks' revenue stream is not from that. So it's from the bigger financing of the kind of mega projects or the oil and gas industry versus the, you and I transacting as we go about our days. Does that influence at all how you see that social ranking?
No, I don't want to unpick that too much, because that could easily bring us down yet another rabbit hole. Okay. But I think for the purposes of the ranking, I think I'm happy where it is.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you for humoring that rather impossible and specious exercise. I'm going to bring us back to the questions and actually go into more specious spaces of imagination. And here there's, we can kind of just think out loud a little bit. So my last 2 questions really are in kind of scenario land, totally up to you where you want to take this. The first one is we've had some breaking news. This just in, you are in charge of everything. You're the chief of the universe. Nothing is in the way. There are no limits. What changes do you make to TD Bank?
So something that TD Bank has done recently, actually, is engaged in basically a racial equity audit. So they've engaged a firm, I think in the last month or 2, to do an audit of their internal practices. And I think the scope of that is limited to racially disparate outcomes on their staff. I would open that up to racially disparate outcomes on their clients as well. And I would not expand it only to their retail banking, but also to their investing. I talked about banks as kind of the gas or the brakes, but not a lot of steering. I think that we need more steering. Since the 1980s, with the kind of retreat of government isn't the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. So says the old adage. The challenge is that we now have very little effective steering. We have little effective regulatory steering. We have some steering that comes from investors, but often their focus is not on some of the social and environmental outcomes that I think it needs to be on. Like, it's one thing to say government isn't effective at or isn't appropriately positioned to provide that steering, but it's another argument altogether to say that steering isn't needed. And we made the jump from government shouldn't be doing that steering to we're okay with no one doing it. And I'm not okay with no one doing it. And investors are really, really well positioned. So that includes, banks who are making these large investments, and infrastructure banks and all kinds of other organizations that make investments. Again, this is not limited to TD Bank, but looking at much more expansive thinking in terms of impact audits along racial dimensions, gender dimensions, looking at sustainability, looking at social inequality and fairness. And there's an area of research that really interests me, which is well-being research. It's not just about physical well-being, it's actually about people's perceived quality of life, both their evaluative well-being, which is their perception of how their life is overall, and their experiential well-being, which is an assessment of how they feel on a day-to-day basis. Those two things are really strongly correlated, but they're not totally overlapping. So Paul Dolan is a great researcher in the UK. He's done amazing work on this. So I'll add to your extremely long reading list by suggesting Paul Dolan.
Yeah, that's great. I'll make a note of that for sure.
So that's one. And I would accompany that audit function with a support function as well. Like, one of the things that I've noticed in working in some organizations is that, for example, if you want to launch a social enterprise or a charity, there's a lot of kind of regulatory administrative work that goes into kind of achieving that status. But it's all very much driven through a compliance lens. And the challenge that I have there is, like, if I don't already know the best way to build a social enterprise to be able to harmonize, like, the kind of commercial aspects with the social aspects and the environmental aspects, none of that compliance work actually helps me to figure it out. Like, none of the compliance work adds value to my business.
Nice. Yeah.
And that, I think, is a major lost opportunity. Like, what if we thought about those kinds of regulatory processes as ones that actually added value to the organization? What if we thought about investor compliance and due diligence as actually adding value to the companies that we are prospectively investing in? Like, that's a really, really different mindset to take to those activities. It's not just about being a gatekeeper of, like, well, I've got all the cash and you want all the cash, so you're coming to me and I'm kind of like fending you off at the door until you show yourself, like, able to disarm me. You're not seeking for some lost golden key that allows you to throw open the door to the vault and access the cash. What if investing with me actually made you a stronger company vis-a-vis getting investment from someone else?
Yeah.
That's something that I would love to see, and something that I think creates such an opportunity for differentiation within a banking sector that is extremely commodified right now.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking of those HSBC posters that you'd see on I always call it the gangplank, but it's not really called the
At the
gangplank.
airport. Yeah.
The breezeway onto the airplanes. And what you're describing is what a lot of the advertising says. But as if you know any entrepreneurs or people who set up organizations, you can say it doesn't quite play out the way it said on the poster. And it also reminds me of how you describe the future you want. Like imagine if the filter through which transactions were flowed had that mindset that you just described, because that's the future we want. It just completely reorients the idea of transactions, of lending. That's great. I love it.
Yeah. So my thinking there is very much influenced by Roger Martin, who's a bit of an inspiration for me. He's kind of my personal thought leader these days. And he wrote a paper, or an article, I should say, in the Harvard Business Review, talking about a different perspective on mergers and acquisitions. So when thinking about, whether to acquire or merge with a certain company, rather than asking, how will we be benefited by this merger or acquisition? The question is, why will that prospective company be better off run by us than run under its current management or run by somebody else entirely? And there's a strong business case for that. The idea behind a merger or an acquisition often is to be able to unlock value that others are not able to unlock. It's not just to say like, well, our balance sheet was this big before and now our balance sheet is this big. You've got all kinds of efficiencies that you want to gain, efficiencies of scale and these kinds of things. And if you ask yourself, like, why will this company be better off under our management than its current situation or managed by someone else? That line of thinking is often very powerful in identifying where the opportunities are to unlock the kind of value that we're seeking. Like ownership is not just, an honorific that we bear, like I own this thing. This is my property and I therefore am more important in virtue of owning it. Like ownership is much richer than that. Like we have responsibility for the thing. We should wish for the well-being of the thing. I'm the parent of a young child, so these things are very salient, at the top of my mind. Like there are people who really think about their kids that way too. Like, I want kids because there's this social script that I'm supposed to be following. And like, I will know that I have arrived as, a fully formed adult when I have a mortgage and, I have kids and I have graying hair and, all of these trappings of, adulting. And I've rarely seen that lead to good outcomes. I know lots of unhappy parents and unhappy kids who are in that situation. And when I kind of port that analogy over to the business world, I also know a lot of unhappy managers and a lot of unhappy companies that, kind of got involved in this, this thing, like they took an investment from somebody or they, acquired some firm because of the prestige that was associated with that transaction, not because the transaction was actually a good idea.
Right.
And we still think about transactions, in my perspective, as far too neutral a medium. Like mergers and acquisitions, investments, like these are not neutral media. I don't just hand you money and my dollar is the same as anyone else's dollar. There really are impacts that come from whose dollar you're getting, except in a situation where all of the investors think the same way and all of the investors treat you the same way and these kinds of things. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, I love it. Yeah, unfortunately, you're not chief in charge of the universe, so that the news item turned out to be fake news. But just before we switch gears to the next scenario, what you're talking about in terms of the well-being economy, I want to just put a little pin and stitch across to another interview. So Our fellow Canadian Mark Anielski. I don't know if you've bumped into his work, but he's the author of the book. I believe it's actually called The Wellbeing Economy. We'll know Roger Martin for sure, and is a highly esteemed economist doing, it sounds like, connected work to the other fellow that you mentioned. So I'll make sure those links are apparent. And this interview that will be linkable will cross-link over to Mark's as well. And you're singing from a similar song sheet. So very neat to hear that. Unfortunately, you're not chief in charge of the universe, but this just in, another news item to be trusted as you see fit, which is that you actually have a direct line to the CEO of TD Bank, so to Bharat Masrani. And, you know, he's a pretty busy guy. He doesn't have a lot of time, but he absolutely takes your calls. He wants to know what you think. The thing is, he's only got 30 seconds. What do you tell him?
How many seconds do I get to think about my 30-second answer?
It's a process I'm inventing here, so take as much time as you like.
Right. I'll just kind of like live stream my stream of thought there.
Yeah.
The first is, you've got an enormous power to create the future for all of us. Another side of that is, you've got an enormous responsibility to create the future for all of us. Riffing off of that, the future for all of us is not one that you can design alone. You need to engage others in figuring out what that future looks like. You probably also need to do a lot of experimentation to figure out the mechanisms that are actually going to be effective in getting us there. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to message it to stakeholders who are expecting like 15-minute guidance on earnings reports. But there are long-term shareholders and long-term stakeholders who are really interested in seeing this play out properly. And those are the people you should be caring about. There are a lot of companies out there that have made this bold play of saying like, well, if this doesn't please the day traders, forget the day traders. Don't be scared.
Nice. Awesome. I'm glad he answered the phone. That is the last question I had prepared for you, but are there other things you would like to answer that I didn't ask you about, or other things you want to make sure we leave on the table here before we sign off?
No, nothing super pressing comes to mind. I think the froth that was bubbling up has all been, skimmed off.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brooke. I really appreciate your insights and your time, and particularly appreciate the vision of the future that you brought forward. So thanks for sharing, and thanks for your time here.
My pleasure. And thank you for collecting all of this and growing all of the garden out of this rich soil.
My pleasure.